Thank you very much. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm very glad to speak here. I normally speak in academic circles or public, and rather nice to be inside the European Commission, which I've said some negative things about in the past. But I have to say some positive things about how I hope you can change your approach to economics and hopefully avoid crises like 2008 happening again. So can I just get just a show of hands? How many people in the room are actually economists? Quite a number, okay, but a lot are not economists. So I'll be giving a presentation which suits both, I hope, economists, but also people from outside economics. And if you read the recent literature on the state of the European Union, there's a fair bit of optimism talking about getting out of the crisis. And clearly, the situation is improving. You still haven't got back to what unemployment was like pre-crisis. So I'm just showing the four major economies in the European Union and using America for reference on that front. Obviously, Spain is by far the worst. And in all these cases, except Germany, unemployment is not back to levels below what applied before the financial crisis hit. Australians use this abbreviation of GFC for global financial crisis, and I'm using that as the marker there. And clearly Spain, it's certainly improving, but it's a long way above what it was before the crisis hit. The same for France, the same for Spain. Only Germany is in a better situation in the European Union than it was before the crisis. And America, Germany again is the only country which has a lower rate of unemployment than America right now. So definitely, okay, improving, but still not back to anything like what it was before the crisis hit. Now, what I'm curious about is what caused the crisis, what's driving this improvement right now. And my focus has been on the role of credit in economics. And that's curious because according to most economists, credit doesn't have any role in economics. So I want to show one country where that seems to apply. This is Germany, and I'm looking at the relationship between the annual change in private debt, which I define as credit. The reason for that is debt is denominated in dollars or euros. It's a stock in your monetary unit. Credit is the flow of new debt per unit of time. And since we work in years in economics, the annual change in private debt is credit. That's my definition. Now, if you look at it, there's virtually no correlation, trivial, minus 0.75, something you can completely ignore. And I think a lot of what goes wrong in economics is extrapolating for particular economies that don't have the characteristics of the rest of the world. And Germany is clearly one of them. Because looking at France, the story is quite different. Same story. I'm looking now at the correlation, again, of change in private debt, which is credit, versus unemployment in France, and it's now minus 0.62, which is much more significant. Clearly something you need to say, what's causing that? By the way, on each of these graphs, on the left-hand scale, I've got the unemployment rate scaled to whatever is relevant for that particular economy. On the right-hand side, I'm graphing credit as measured as a percentage of GDP from plus 40% to minus 20%. And the reason for that range is basically in one word, is Spain, as you'll see in a moment. So the blue line shows credit in France peaking at about 12% of GDP before the crisis, 12% after as well, running about 10% of GDP right now. But there is a strong correlation. Something, if you're an empirically driven person, you'd say, what's causing that? Okay, you'd want to find out what it is. Here's Italy, minus 0.75. Again, an extremely large correlation. Something you'd want to investigate if you were concerned about whatever you're looking at from an empirical point of view. You'd want to know what's driving that. And you can see that in this case, credit peaking at about 15% before the crisis, falling to minus 7%, and for most of the last decade being negative. Now, Spain. This is probably the most stunning chart on this particular issue that I've ever produced. The correlation is so strong, for those of us who are old enough in the room to remember these things, it almost looks like a Rorschach plot. You remember the old Rorschach plots to try to do psychological analysis? Whack an ink blot on a paper, fold it over and see what the pattern was? These are two factors which are so closely correlated, they're virtually perfectly negatively correlated. Now clearly, if you're empirically driven, what is causing that is a major question. And now for reference, the United States, and one of the reasons the United States is so effective at making comparisons like this, despite Donald Trump's recent complaints, it's still, in its sense, the most self-contained economy in the world. Okay? It leaves out a lot of the other factors that affect you, international trade, financial flows and so on. Relative to the size of the economy, they're smaller in the United States than almost any other economy on the planet because it's the biggest economy on the planet. The correlation there, minus 0.89. Clearly, if you're driven by empirical data, you have to say what the hell is causing this? What's the relationship? Now, the causation in the textbooks is there's no causation. The argument in conventional economic theory is there's no relationship between credit and macroeconomics. And my best quote on that comes from Ben Bernanke. This is from his essays on the Great Depression, stating that the reason he rejected Fisher's debt deflation explanation for the Great Depression was that credit is a pure redistribution. It transfers spending power from one person to another, and therefore a bit like a seesaw, if one person goes up, the other person goes down, and the average height of the seesaw does not change. So you don't need to understand credit in trying to understand macroeconomics. And notice that statement, pure redistributions, which he sees as being credit, should have no significant macroeconomic effects. Now that's clearly wrong on the data I've shown you for the crisis. It's also clearly wrong when you look at the data for the Great Depression. So the views that are expressed there by Bernanke are not based on empirical data. They're based on a priori concepts about the role of credit in a model of the macroeconomy. And if you look at mainstream models, DSGE, but also ISLM and ASAD and all the others, they have no role for credit. And that's because the textbook version of banking says bankings are just intermediaries who transfer spending power from one person to another and therefore no aggregate effect. And that's called the loanable funds model, of course, as most people who have done economics would know in the room. But it basically says banks are intermediaries. Their role is to take money from savers and give it to borrowers, and they charge, the borrowers effectively get the interest rate and the bank effectively charges a fee. That's the notion of what banking is like. Now, for 40 or 50 years, a group of economists that I'm part of has been saying that's clearly wrong about how banks actually behave. And I've had to quote people you've probably never heard of. Has anybody here heard of Basil Moore? Nobody's heard of Basil Moore. Okay. What about Alan Holmes? Okay. Have you heard of the Bundesbank? They're now saying the same thing. Banks can create book money just by making an accounting entry. And this refutes a popular misconception that banks simply act as intermediaries at the time of lending. Now, when we normally talk about popular misconceptions, what we're talking about is something the public believes that the expert knows is wrong. In this case, we're talking about something that the experts believe that most of the public know is wrong. Okay? That's quite weird. When you look at it, now the Bundesbank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Norway have all come out and said banks create money by lending. And therefore an essential part, well, I'm going to show that it's essential, but a serious, significant part of economic theory is wrong. So what does that mean about the impact of that for macroeconomics? Does that fact that the technical model of banking that is taught to students, that is accepted by virtually everybody who does an economics degree, about 1 in 6 reject it, but 5 out of 6 accept it, and they end up getting the big jobs and we get the minor ones. Does it affect macroeconomics? Well, I want to show you why it does, and I want to show it logically and mathematically. And I've developed what I call an expenditure income matrix. It's quite a simple idea, and that is that I'm going to show expenditure on the rows of a matrix between different sectors. It can be different sectors, different individuals, different countries. It really doesn't matter what the actual grouping is. You're showing expenditure from one point to another point. Now, of course, if I'm showing expenditure, spending and receipt of that expenditure, all the rows have to sum to 0. So expenditure sums to 0 across the matrix. But vertically, the matrix is giving you income. And of course, income can be positive or negative for any person in that pattern. And the trace of the matrix is showing expenditure. So the negative of the trace gives you income measured by the expenditure, GDP measured by the expenditure method. Whereas the off trace elements give you aggregate income. That's where the residue goes. And of course, the two have to be identical. So that's one of the key insights of macroeconomics is expenditure is income. There is no difference. One causes the other. And I want to show the causal direction out of this and the role of credit in it. So if you imagine you have a Say's law type economy where there's no creation of money whatsoever, and so all transactions are using existing money. Well, in that case, sector A, I'm going to call the sectors A, B and C, capital A, capital B, capital C. Sector A is spending little a on sector B and little b on sector C, and ditto for the other two sectors. So that's your expenditure. Now, if you say what's the sum of all that, you get Milton Friedman's quantity theory of money out of that, because what I've got is this existing stock of money being spent by everybody per year on the other sectors. And so if you add up those sums and say that's velocity of money times the existing stock of money, you get Milton Friedman's quantity theory of money. Okay? Now, what if I include loanable funds? Well, in loanable funds, one non-bank lends to another non-bank. And what I'm looking at here is transactions between non-bank entities. So in this particular case, I'm going to have sector B lending to sector A, or sector 2 lending to sector 1. It's less confusing if you're looking at A's and B's there, and consider 1, 2 and 3 for the labelling of the sectors. So I have sector 2 lending a flow of little L dollars per year to sector 1, and that therefore shows up on the diagonal. So there's the lending by sector 1 to sector 2 to sector 1. And sector 1 then spends that money on sector 3. And because, so that's the flow of new loans, flow in terms of dollars per year or euros per year. And then B, because of that flow, the amount of money that sector 2 has to spend falls, the amount of money that sector 1 has to spend rises, and that's your seesaw effect. Now, A then borrows that money to spend, or sector 1 borrows to spend on sector 3. I'm sorry to have A's and C's, they're confusing things. You realise these things after you write your presentations. But that's the basic story. You borrow money to spend it. But what's happening is the flows cancel out, both in the income and the expenditure direction. Those flows cancel. So what you're left with, as it happens, are the interest payments on the stock of existing debt. Because the reason sector 2 is lending to sector 1 is to get an interest rate return, and that actually turns up in the figures. And in fact, it turns out to be gross financial transactions. So if I included paying interest on bank accounts here, I'd get the deposit interest turning up in positive terms as well as the loan interest, which was something I didn't expect. But the flows cancel out, and what you find is you get the quantity theory of money plus gross financial flows. Okay? So you get I'm doing the same substitution. I'm using a symbolic mathematics program here just to make it obvious that there are no errors in the logic. So what I have the money times velocity plus interest on outstanding debt. So that becomes the gross measure of expenditure and the gross measure of income. That itself is one change from conventional thinking. Now, what about if we take a look at what I call bank originated money and debt? My particular subset of economists have referred to this for ages as endogenous money. Now, it's one of those terms you have to be on the inside to know what the hell it means. So I think I prefer the BOMD, bombed. Bank originated money and debt. That's what we're actually talking about, and I think that acronym makes sense as well. So in that particular case, I have a bank crediting agent A, agent 1, with a new flow of debt. Now that's not shown in the table because I'm just looking at the transactions flow at this stage. But there's no offsetting transaction in either expenditure or income in that particular case. So here's the matrix. There's a flow of new loans, which is this L here, which is being spent by the agent sector 1 on sector 3. So that's the flow of new loans being spent on the other sector. You borrow money to spend. Imagine you've gone shopping at Sainsbury's or whatever the Belgium equivalent is of a major shopping centre. When you swipe your credit card, you get the debt, Sainsbury gets the money. Okay, it's a simultaneous expenditure and income in that particular case. And the agent then pays interest to the bank now rather than paying to but I've now got the bank turning up in the system because the bank's transactions are now part of the overall system. And when I do my trace there, what's my sum? I'm just replacing L, this flow here, with the rate of DDDT to indicate the rate of change of private debt, which I define as credit. Aggregate income now includes the change in debt. So credit is an essential part of aggregate expenditure and aggregate income. And that applies even more so when we consider asset purchases rather than just goods and services. But therefore, you have to include credit in your analysis of aggregate demand. If you don't, you're missing out something of the order of 20 to 25% of the economy. And if you miss that much of the economy, you're not going to go know what's happening. So it matters because expenditure determines income. That's the direction of causation. Somebody has to spend for you to get the income. So expenditure causes income and they are identical. Of course, I've got to include capital gains when I generalise that to include asset markets, but that's the basic logic. And there are two sources of expenditure, not just one. There's the turnover of existing money, which is Milton Friedman's MV equals PT, plus credit money created by new bank lending, and that's got a one-for-one correlation. The change in debt is precisely equal to the change in money because you wouldn't take on the debt unless the bank gave you exactly the same amount of money. Imagine if a bank said, we're going to lend you $100,000 in your account and we're charging you $200,000 in debt. Would anybody take that deal? The other way around you might, okay, but not that way. So that gives you an idea of the amount of contribution that credit makes to total demand. And we do not separately record the turnover of existing money and the creation of new money. We could ask our statisticians to do that, and that'd be extremely useful for guiding economic research once you realise the role that credit has. But you can roughly measure it with some double counting by saying, let's add GDP and the change in debt per year to get a rough measure of aggregate expenditure, because most of that credit now is created to buy assets. It's not created to buy goods and services. There's an indirect way in which that helps the turnover of existing money for goods and services, but it's not direct anymore. It should be. Okay? Frankly, it should be. So what you get is not pure distributions, but an expansion and contraction of demand with extremely significant macroeconomic impacts. And for that reason, the global financial crisis was not a black swan. It was obvious to anybody who understood the role of debt. Now, unfortunately, because of the training of economists, that did not include 80% of economists. Roughly 1 in 6, I would say, of economists, academic economists, are non-mainstream. The reason for that is the French recently, you know how the French system is quite hierarchical. I imagine the Belgian system is similar. So there are 1,700 academic economists in France. When what's called the Society of Appalled Economists tried to form an alternative division, 1 in 6 of those people applied to join. So that's a rough measure of how many economists are non-mainstream. But the mainstream dominates policy, dominates thinking about the economy in general. So it wasn't impossible to foresee, and there are 2 economists who foresaw it with a version of mathematical modelling, myself and Wynne Godley, not recently deceased, but we both used monetary flow models to say this crisis was going to happen. Wynne's first prediction was in 1999. My first was at the end of 2005. Now, I know how economics develops. I've been an economist for 45 years. I've seen this stuff happen all the time. Somebody will say, oh, we can find a reason not to consider this anyway. And the paper's just recently been published by these 2 academics. I think it's in a German research centre. Loanable funds versus money creation, a benchmark result. So it's no longer possible for the mainstream to ignore that banks create money when central banks are saying they create money. But it is possible for them to say, oh, well, even if they do, it makes no difference. And I'm sure at some stage in future when I raise this point, somebody will say, look, Farr and Gerbach show that loanable funds and endogenous money can be used one for the other with no loss of generality. And somebody will take that seriously and ignore the whole area that I'm in, and they will be committing an incredible intellectual crime. Because this is the abstract of that paper. In what circumstances do they yield the same outcomes? We establish a simple benchmark result. Take 60 pages of mathematics to get there, by the way, using an overlapping generations model, but I suppose you can call that simple. In the absence of uncertainty, and thus any bank default, both processes yield the same allocation. Hence, in such cases, using the loanable funds model as a shortcut does not imply any loss of generality. What planet, in what universe, does that apply to? In the absence of uncertainty, and thus of bank default. It's a domain assumption. One of the great travesties of economics is disguising what are actually called domain assumptions as simplifying assumptions. Because when any student objects to the assumptions they're expected to accept in the theory, they'll be told, well, we must make simplifying assumptions. Now, a simplifying assumption, for example, is leaving out topography when you draw a road map, because cars have got enough horsepower to ignore the hills. But presuming you live in a universe where there's no uncertainty and therefore no risk of bank default, is taking yourself to a planet in a universe that hasn't been invented yet. Okay? It's a domain assumption. Therefore, the obvious result is to say you can't use loanable funds. But this simple summary will be used to say you can use loanable funds. Now, I find it breathtaking that this sort of thing happens, but at the same time I find it predictable. I was expecting a paper like this to be written. Now, I want to show why this is wrong, using a different form of logic to what they used, which is using my software package called Minsky. Has anybody here worked in system dynamics or seen system dynamics programs? Okay, that's again very common. They were invented 60 years ago by engineers. Has anybody flown in a plane recently or driven in a car that's less than 30 years old? Okay, whatever you were in was designed in software using system dynamics in the first pass. And it's MATLAB, Mathematica, VenSim, Stellar, those are some of the programs. And they don't have to assume equilibrium to model the systems. I've put a few classic chaotic system models there in Minsky, and if anybody wants to check this out later, I'll pass the presentation on and you can download the simulations from there. But sitting behind, they have flowcharts that develop models of dynamic systems. So this, for example, you've all heard of the butterfly effect. This is where the idea of the butterfly effect came from. And I might bring that up, so I'll just show what I'm talking about here. It's a set of 3 equations with 3 parameters. It's very hard to get a simpler model than that. When you simulate it, this is the behavior that it gives you. In the right-hand graph, which is a graph of the temperature differential in this model against the x location in a 2-dimensional plane, that's where the idea of the butterfly effect came from. That system has 3 equilibria. They are all unstable. I think you can spot 2 of them. One's there. I started the system right near one of the equilibria. It was blasted away from it. There's the second equilibrium, and the third one is down here. Now, the system will never be in any of those 3 positions, okay, because they're all unstable. And that's a common thing in complex systems and nonlinear dynamics in general. The whole idea that you should think about these as equilibria is nonsense, unfortunately. Now, people think you can't model. If you say you're going to go away from equilibria, how can you model? Those are the equations built by these software packages. That's Minsky doing it in that particular case. Now, I tried to build these models using conventional system dynamics tools, and it was just a mess, because to record financial transactions properly, you have to record them 4 times. That's the buyer and seller, bank A, bank B type thing. There's 4 places where it turns up. Using the flowchart technology that those programs were designed using, you get a mess of spaghetti. You might as well throw a bowl of spaghetti on a table and try to work out where one little piece of spaghetti goes to the next. So I designed Minsky using the world's first GUI, graphical user interface, which was invented by accountants 500 years ago, double entry bookkeeping. And I call them Godley tables in honor of Wynne Godley, who developed much the same idea. And what you do is you record every transaction twice on the one line, from the source to the sink in dynamic terms, and you make sure that it obeys the rule that assets minus liabilities minus equity equals 0. Once you've done that, you know your equations are consistent. So that's the basic idea of a Godley table. We have assets, liabilities, and equities defined. The flows are shown on each of the rows. The change in stocks is shown by the columns, and it gives us the overall dynamics. So if I put loanable funds together in a Minsky model, what I'm showing here is lending between a consumer sector and an investment sector. And this is aping a model done by Krugman and Eggertson some years ago to argue that debt matters during a financial crisis, but not at other times. So just reading the logic, the consumer sector lends to the investment sector repays, the investment sector pays interest, the consumer sector pays fees to the bank for arranging the loan, the consumer sector hires workers, the investment sector hires workers, the consumer sector buys investment goods, the So the investment sector buys investment goods, the consumer sector buys investment goods, workers consume, bankers consume, and bankers invest. Okay? It's fairly easy to read that. If I showed you as a flow chart, it would be a mess. So that's why I designed Minsky in the first place, to make it easier to do that. And when I put that together in a loanable funds model, in Minsky rather, pardon me, this is what it looks like. And what I can do with Minsky is I can run the model and I can change the rate of lending and the rate of repayment as the simulation goes. So you can see the growth rate is converging to zero there. GDP is pretty much constant, so is the velocity of money. And if I speed up lending, pardon me, we've got to change the, you can touch the mice up here and create something you don't want to create far too easily. But I sped up lending, I'm slowing down repayment. You'll see the debt ratio is rising quite significantly. The growth rate dips a bit. GDP is still pretty constant. There's a dramatic level change in the ratio of debt to GDP, but not much happening in the economy itself. And if I go back in the opposite direction and slow down lending and speed up how fast loans are repaid, then the debt ratio will start to fall. The growth rate actually rose during the repayment crisis. Not much change to GDP. In that situation, you can ignore credit. So in a structural sense, if the assumption of loanable funds was correct, it would also be correct to say that you don't need to include banks or debt or money in your macroeconomic models. Now, I want to quickly show why that's wrong, because what I can do with Minsky is I'll just make that graph a bit larger. Okay. I'm currently showing the debt as an asset of the consumer sector. Now in the real world, okay, there is some lending between non-banks, but most lending is by banks to non-banks. So I'm going to delete that column, pardon me, and then I'm going to delete the financial transactions that are shown to occur between consumer sector and the investment sector, and then come over to the banking sector's view of the economy. Trying to grab that 1 pixel point where I can expand that window. Okay, make it larger for you. And now I can click and add an extra column for the assets of the banking sector. And this down arrow lets me choose what liabilities haven't currently been allocated to somebody else as an asset. And it shows that debt hasn't been allocated. So I click on debt. It brings across the operations. All I need to do is show the interest payments are now made to the bank. Pardon me. Minsky's doing error checking over here to make sure rows sum symbolically to zero. I delete the bank fee, which doesn't exist. I've made no other changes to the model. And now let's run it again. And I think the changes are obvious straight away. You've got a positive rate of growth with the levels I've got for lending and repayment there. If I make lending happen more rapidly, there's a boost to the growth rate. If repayment slows down, even more of a boost. But then if you have repayment speeding up and lending slowing down, not only does the debt ratio fall, but so does GDP. So that's a very simple illustration of just how important it is to include credit in your thinking. If you're not including it, you're not modelling capitalism. So that's what I've shown you there a moment ago. So clearly credit matters, but why did we have such a big crisis in 2008 versus smaller ones we've had in previous years where a similar slowdown has occurred? And the reason here is the scale. It isn't just the level of credit, it's also the level of debt and how that relates to GDP. So I want to give you a simple numerical example here. And what you can have a crash in the economy just when the rate of growth of debt slows down. So credit doesn't have to turn negative to give you a crisis, but the reason it did give us one in 2008 is for a lot of countries it did turn negative. So I'm going to have aggregate demand as the turnover of existing money plus credit. I'm going to pretend that 100% of that credit goes to asset prices so I can add the two up. without any double entry, double counting errors. But let's start with the situation which applied back in America in the 50s and 60s and applied in a lot of Europe as well, where the debt ratio was quite low, say 50% of GDP. So if your GDP was $1 trillion at that stage, your debt level was 50% of that, or $500 billion. And if the GDP is growing at roughly 10%, this is nominal GDP, and credit's growing at 20%, then total demand is going to be the 500 billion, the 1 trillion of actual turnover of existing money, plus 20% of 50 billion, 500 billion, which will give you $100 billion. So your total demand is 1.1 trillion. Now imagine the next year, the rate of growth of debt slows down to the same rate of growth of the economy. So your debt to GDP ratio stabilises, doesn't have to fall. Next year, your turnover of existing money will also grow by 10%. I'm just taking that as a given. The growth of debt slows down to 10%. 10% of 600 billion is another $60 billion in demand. So your total demand is 1.16 trillion. Now that's more than the year beforehand. Okay. Now if I take exactly the same situation but have a higher debt ratio, and these are the ratios that apply now of roughly 200% of GDP, then in that first year, 20% of 2 trillion is $400 billion. Your total demand is 1.4 trillion. That looks like a booming economy. Politicians would be taking credit for that, wouldn't they? Then the next year, same rate of growth of GDP, the growth of debt slows down to 10%. 10% of 2.4 trillion is 240 billion. You add that onto 1.1 trillion of turnover from existing money, you get a total demand of 1.34 trillion. That's $60 billion less than the year before, even with the debt still rising. And that's the trap we can get ourselves caught into. You don't need to have a fall in credit, negative credit, to have a crisis, but it helps. And unfortunately, that's what happened back in 2008. So both the level and the rate of change matter, and that's why 2008 was so bad, because so much that had accumulated over the previous 50 or 60 years. So, obviously we need to change how we do economics, given that realisation. And that there was some admittance by some leading economists that we had to change the modelling approach which dominates economics, which are DSGE models, dynamic, stochastic, general, equilibrium. From my point of view, by the way, they're neither dynamic nor general. They're stochastic equilibrium models. But Narayana Kocherlakota, who used to be a great champion of these models and was a Federal Reserve chairman, he said we simply do not have a successful model of the macroeconomy. That's a very big statement. Olivier Blanchard, who again was a great champion of these models, said they're based on unappealing assumptions, not merely simplifying, but ones that are profoundly at odds with the real world. And I completely agree with that. Paul Romer, who's had a fairly dramatic career, I'm sure you're all aware of Paul Romer's ins and outs recently, he said macro's gone backwards for 3 decades. So there's some strong realisation of the need for change. But because we're now 10 years after the crisis, the mainstream is reasserting its belief system. And one of my favourite papers on this front came out recently by Cristiano Eichenbaum and Trabant. And the abstract down there says, at one point, the only place we can do experiments is in dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models. Now, after an uproar from a lot of critics, including myself, they changed that to one place that we can do it. What they actually believe is the only place. So I'm choosing the one before they got the pushback from the public and people like myself. Now, they accused anybody who doesn't like these models of being dilettantes. Okay? In other words, saying, you're just waving your hands, you can't make any serious observations about this garbage. Pardon me, but that's nonsense. The trouble is economists are so narrowly trained, they're not aware of all the other modelling techniques that exist that can be used to handle complex systems like the economy. So I want to give you a couple of them. One is machine learning. There's a whole range of different approaches. As it happens, I was extremely lucky to supervise a brilliant PhD student who's now making a very healthy living, thank you very much, working in financial markets. But he wrote a brilliant paper applying neural networks to macroeconomics. He won the University Medal for Electrical Engineering as an undergraduate and did his PhD in economics with me, applying these same models to economic issues. And as part of his thesis, he also developed what I call the Technicolor model of a neural network. I know this will be pretty weird for anybody looking at it who's not got a computer background or electronics. Does anybody have an electronics background? Nobody. Okay. That's pretty much the way electrical circuits are laid out. It's a very, once you understand the logic, it's a very simple way of working out what the causal structure is inside a neural network. But that's his invention. I call it the Technicolor diagram. Now, when he put the models together and trained the data, so the model itself was saying, what's the data, what structure of equations generates a result in my array of equations that fits the data, he found that his models, even his poorest models, were better predictors of the economy's future behaviour than the best models from the Reserve Bank of Australia and from the Treasury. His root mean square error was lower in all those cases, significantly lower than the best models produced by the Treasury and the Reserve Bank of Australia. And since he wrote that PhD, the quality of neural networks has risen drastically. Does anybody here use Google Translate? I'm living in Amsterdam now, and I'm walking around supermarket shelves doing this and translating the labels. It's magnificent. That's all a substantial improvement in the neural networks behind processing. So we could build a giant neural network of the economy, not know what the hell is causing the internal structure, but get far more accurate predictions than we get out of DSG models, or for that matter, the models that I've invented so far. So I think it's something which you should seriously consider. Now, what I do is called complex systems models, and I do agree with the mainstream that ad hoc models don't make sense. We need some sort of logical foundation you can't question. But what mainstream economists believe is that you must therefore use micro to derive macro. Take the building block, take the Lego blocks and build the structure out of the Lego blocks. Understand the Lego blocks, you understand the structure. And that's Olivier Blanchard's position. And notice his reason. It is hard to see where else to start from. That's not the best logical reason to do something. I can't think of anything else. If you read the economic literature properly, and most economists do not read it properly, it tells us you can't do it because even market-level microeconomics cannot be derived from individual-level microeconomics. This is called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem for those who haven't seen it before. And this is the summary of the theorem by Sonnenschein and Schaefer in the Handbook of Mathematical Economics. It's rather hard to get a more authoritative volume than that. And they say strong restrictions, now those strong restrictions are simply impossible restrictions, are needed to justify the hypothesis that a market demand function has the characteristics of a consumer demand function. The utility hypothesis tells us nothing about market demand. So what they're saying fundamentally is, in a generalised system with generalised consumers and generalised commodities, you cannot derive a market demand curve that slopes downwards. Okay? That's the basic idea of a consumer demand one. So how on earth can you derive macro from micro if you can't derive micro from micro? Okay? Now my approach is to say you can actually derive macro from macro itself. That might sound a bit contradictory, but I'll give you a reason why. I'm going to take 3 macroeconomic definitions that are impossible to refute because they are definitions, and I've now shown the third one matters, which is the debt to GDP ratio. So I'm going to take the employment rate, number of people with a job divided by population, the wages share of GDP, and the debt to GDP ratio, and differentiate them with respect to time. That gives me those 3 expressions. What that's basically saying is the rate of change of employment is the gap between the rate of change of GDP and the rate of change of population and technology, or labour productivity. That's the first one. The second is saying the rate of change of wages, share of GDP, is the difference between the rate of change of wages themselves and the rate of change of labour productivity. And the final one, the debt ratio, is the change in the ratio is the gap between the change in debt and the change in GDP. And if you think about them in dynamic terms, the first is saying employment will rise if the growth rate exceeds the sum of population and labour productivity growth. Wages output will rise if wage rises exceed the growth in labour productivity, and debt ratio will rise if debt grows faster than GDP. So that's not a model yet, they're truisms. Now I can turn it into a model, and this is one of the insights of complex systems. You don't need complicated definitions of individual behaviour to derive a model, the deep characteristics of a model, so long as you have the relationships between the system states properly recorded, which is what I've done here. So I'm going to have a very simple assumption of a linear capital output ratio and linear depreciation. So output is capital divided by an accelerator. The rate of change of capital is gross investment minus linear depreciation. A linear Phillips curve, so I have workers reacting to the employment rate in a very linear way. We know it's non-linear, but this is starting with the first approximation. So there's a slope for the labour function, a level of employment at which workers neither demand wage rises nor accept wage cuts, and that's that simple equation there. A linear investment function, so I have investment based on the rate of profit. And then profit is net of wages payments, but also what you pay to bankers. There are three social classes, in other words, in the model. And debt finance simply finances investment. So there's no Ponzi scheme and behaviour going on here. Every dollar borrowed is borrowed to build capital, stock, machinery. So it's not a Ponzi world. And then I've got constant growth in labour productivity and population. And what you get out of that is a simple model which has 3 variables and 8 parameters. Again, extremely simple model. And it's a bit like Lorenz's model. When you look at the dynamics of it, it has, I'll use the mathematical terms, one state, it's got 1 real eigenvalue and 2 complex. That's almost a necessity for these sorts of models. And the real part of the complex one turns positive as I increase how responsive capitalists are to the rate of profit in terms of how much they want to invest. I explained that for my students, rather more lengthy terms than I did there. Now, if I bring this model up in Minsky, I'm going to start it with having capitalists being not particularly responsive to the rate of profit, so a low value for the slope of the profit function there. And if I simulate, let's see, big down to 5 is a good value. Okay, I simulate this, you get cycles in employment, cycles in the wage share, cycles in the debt level, but they all converge nicely to equilibrium. So if you saw this happening, you'd be thinking, oh great, the economy it's cyclical, but it's approaching a nice equilibrium. No reason to be concerned. And it will get to an equilibrium if I keep on going. If I stop that and make the profit function more responsive, which is what you'd actually want to have, you want to have capitalists who are willing to invest, and run it again, you appear to get the same dynamics. You might even call that a great moderation, cycles diminishing all the way. But then this happens. The cycles start to get larger. And if I run it for long enough, the system will break down. Now that's a deeper insight into the nature of capitalism than anything you saw in mainstream models. You get a great moderation followed by a great recession. And technically it's called the Pommer-Maneville route to chaos. You get cyclical rising debt levels, which we've seen in the data, and you get rising inequality because the wages share is falling all the way through. In fact, even though in the model itself I've got firms which are owned by capitalists being the only ones who borrow, their share of profit of income remains roughly constant. It's the workers who have a diminishing share. So the rising level of debt is directly correlated to a rising inequality and a falling workers' share. And again, I think that's empirically valid. Now, the difference is just the willingness to invest, as I've shown there. That's another version of the same model. A low willingness to invest gives you a convergence to a good equilibrium, but strangely enough, a high growth rate and stable income shares. A high willingness to invest, which you'd actually want, gives you a convergence to a bad equilibrium where there's zero wages share, zero employment, and infinite debt ratio, a lower growth rate, and rising inequality. These are all emergent properties of an extremely simple complex systems model. And it shows, in fact, that the main class struggle in capitalism is not worker versus capitalist, which is Marx's classic argument, it's worker versus banker. Now, if I put prices into the system, it's still a very simple model. And given time, I won't take you through the dynamics overall there. I'm happy to do it in question time if you like later. But the same sort of dynamics happen in a richer fashion. This is still only a second stage iteration of a model. Okay? I want to go far more detailed than this. but I'm already capturing a lot of the actual behaviour of capitalism with that. It's inherently cyclical. Just when it seems like you're out of the cycles, you have a crisis that wipes out the economy. Rising private debt is the cause of the crisis. And the last one's to know are the capitalists, because from their point of view, the rising amount of money they're paying to bankers is offset by a falling amount going to workers until deflation causes the debt to accelerate and you have a crisis like 2008 or like the Great Depression. So there's lots more that I've done in the same model and want to do further, including government feedbacks, putting in multi-sectoral behaviour and so on. All that is quite possible. Now, another way to model, that's two I've shown you so far. A third approach, which is also very popular in the post-Keynesian economic tradition these days, is called monetary stock flow consistent modelling. And it's using the sort of flows that I showed you a moment ago with the Minsky table to say, given these directions of flows, this must be happening to the stocks. If that's not sustainable, then these things must turn around at some time in the future. And this is showing the simplest possible idea of savings. We all think savings is a good idea, don't we? Good idea to save money? Well, I'm going to show here, I've got a very simple model where I have poor households, rich households and firms. And they've each got $100 in their bank accounts or 100 euros, and they're each spending 100 euros on each of the other two social classes. And then one of them decides to save money, which we're always encouraging. Let's all be, is it called Swabian housewives? Let's all be Swabian housewives. Well, what you get out of that system is that model in Minsky is a simple set of differential equations showing the flows. And if I bring this model up, is that it's extremely simple. Let's just see if I can make that a bit larger. Again, grabbing that single pixel is a real pain. Okay. And I'll show the values on the table there. So I've got each of the poor households are spending 100 per year on the rich and 100 per year on the firms. The rich are spending on the poor and the firms exactly the same levels. And then if I run the system and I have what you get out of that is GDP is 600, okay, 3 bits of 200 per year. All the bank accounts are constant and there's no aggregate savings. What if the poor households decide to spend less, so they save 10 a year? Notice what happens to GDP. It falls by 10 per year. And their money is being redistributed between the bank accounts. You can't create money by saving it. Aggregate savings is still zero. Now, the rich don't like having less money, so they decide to spend less as well. And now we find GDP's fallen by another 10. And if the firms decided to do the same thing, GDP falls by another 10. This is the paradox of thrift, shown dynamically. Savings at the individual or sectoral level becomes an identical fall in GDP at the aggregate level. Savings is not a good idea. Okay? You can't extrapolate what's good for the individual to what's good for the collective. All you've done is slow down the velocity of circulation of money, creating less GDP out of the same amount of money. That's been the consequence of trying to save at the individual level. Now, I think that's a fairly strong indication of why it matters to have sectoral financial models as part of economics. And I'll give you a horror story. This is work being done by a PhD student of mine. That's a model of the Portuguese economy. It is a disaster to look at, okay? Visual nightmare, because I haven't had enough money to improve how we can define terms in Minsky, so everything goes dumped on a canvas. But in fact, that's a more accurate model of Portugal than anything the Portuguese Treasury or the Portuguese Central Bank has produced. And he did that as a master's thesis. Now, I knew at the time he did it that it wasn't possible to do what he did. He didn't know that, so he did it, and he's now my PhD student. Brilliant piece of work. But that is a stock flow, monetary stock flow consistent model of Portugal that is more accurate than anything the central bank or the Treasury currently has. So those are 3 different ways I've shown you that you can model the economy in addition to DSGE. And my plea to the European Commission is please start developing those sorts of models. Add that to your repertoire. It's possible. We can't be stuck with a monolithic way of thinking about the economy when history has proven that monolithic way is wrong. I'll leave it there and take questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So confused layman. An economist at all. But I think I can read some things. For example, so you mentioned one luminary saying that macroeconomics was going backwards during the last 30 years. But it was going backwards in the West, but in a very rewarding way. They have received how many? About 60 Nobel Prizes.
Yeah.
So not a single Easterner or Easterner affiliated with Eastern institutions. All the prizes went to the West.
I think there's Vassily Leontiev as one exception there.
Yes, but probably still affiliated with the Western.
Oh yeah, he was based in America at the time.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. So what would you say in defense of academic research?
I would say nothing in defense of academic research. No, this is one of the great problems is that intellectual disciplines can be captured by a particular ideology, whether they know they're an ideology or not. And economics has been captured by neoclassical theory, and they genuinely believe they're scientists, but they don't have the feedback that genuine scientists have from experiment. Which means one of my favourite statements, I've forgotten who it was, was on the door of one of my colleagues, the great tragedy of science is a beautiful hypothesis destroyed by an ugly experiment. Well, the ugly experiments in economics happen at the level of the entire global economy. And unfortunately, the Nobel Prize was instituted by the Swedish Central Bank, and the Swedish Central Bank was itself already very much in the monetarist camp. They gave it to one interesting person to begin with, which is Hayek, but almost exclusively their choices since then have been from the predominantly American neoclassical community. The only Nobel Prize that I give any credence for in economics in the last, well, there's 2 or 3, but the one I most like is by Robert Shiller, because Shiller has been genuinely empirical and genuinely produced a lot of very useful indicators and has stuck his neck out and opposed the profession on a lot of occasions. But generally speaking, you're quite right. It's a closed shop. It doesn't admit in thinking from the other parts of the world, let alone other orientations in economic thought.
So a bit of a question, not on the theory, but going back to the reality. After the financial crisis, the debt problem has certainly not.
Can you speak up a bit? Sorry, yeah.
After the financial crisis, the debt problem has certainly not gone away.
Yeah.
You have quite a bit of a build-up in private debt, particularly in emerging economies, China being the notable example.
Yeah.
Probably slow down of the debt growth in the advanced economies, but yet it's still growing. So how concerned are you, and in what sort of time horizon?
Good question. I'm very concerned. I describe countries that have had a debt crisis like America, the UK, Spain, Ireland, and very originally, of course, Japan, as being the walking dead of debt. They've got such an accumulation of private debt that the capacity for private debt to grow, which gives you credit, is very low. And particularly in the case of Japan, because their corporations rely upon a large amount of borrowed money through the keiretsu system for their investment, they stopped investing about 25 years ago on the scale they used to do, which is why Japan has been, missing in action from the global economy for so long. The United States, the UK, I think also Europe now, you're now back in a period of growth, which is largely driven by credit, as I showed you in those early charts. Now, if you have economists who believe they don't even think about credit, they're going to think, well, now a return to normal again, and you can find Paul Krugman saying that, for example, as well as people in the European Union. Therefore, it's time to get interest rates back to normal again. And when they start doing that, what will happen is the private sector will have an enormous hit to its capacity to consume, and the response of the private sector may be to go back into deleveraging again, which means credit will turn from positive to negative once more, and you'll fall back into another slump. Now, Japan's been doing that for 1/4 of a century. And of course, if you look back on the Great Depression wasn't just one event for America, it was 2. There was the initial crisis from late 29 through to 36. Unemployment went from 0, the recorded figures, the NBER's recorded figures was 0% of the population was unemployed. to, I think there were 6,000 unemployed workers recorded in their database at the time. 0% to 26% by 32, 33. Then it fell to 10% or 11%, I think, by 36. And at this stage, Roosevelt was convinced by his economic advisors it was time to balance the government's books again. So the stimulus from the Great Deal was stopped, taxation rates were raised, etc. And the private sector started to delever again. And unemployment rose from 11% to 20% by 1937. Now that's when Keynes's general theory came out. And of course, at this stage, the economics profession just basically said, we don't know what the hell's happening. We give up. And that's why I think Keynes was so heavily accepted at that time. I think we're repeating the same process. When central banks start putting up rates and believing they're going to get back to the old 2% inflation rate, 3% growth and 4% reserve rate of interest, that's their target. They're going to find they'll push the economy back into deleveraging once more. So those are the walking dead of debt. Until we reduce private debt levels, we're going to continue repeating that process. But the rest of the world, some countries avoided the crisis. My home country, for example, Australia, avoided the crisis. How did it do it? By encouraging more private borrowing. So debt levels in Australia, Canada, China, Sweden, Norway, Belgium, well exceed 200% of GDP. And they are what I call the zombies to be, because at some stage that debt growth is going to stop. When it does, credit will turn negative, and those economies will have slumps. So that's what I think is going to happen in the next 1 to 3 years. It appears to be happening already in Canada and Australia. In China, it's masked by the scale of government spending. So I've seen estimates that the scale of the government spending in excess of taxation is 15% of GDP right now. And colleagues of mine say that's got to be understated. That's the scale of the Silk Road projects, infrastructure and so on. That is 1.5 times the size of the Obama stimulus. And that's before we've seen credit definitively turn negative in China. So China can mask it to some degree, and that's a good thing for the global economy because it keeps some demand coming in. But Canada, Australia, South Korea, Belgium, Norway, Sweden are all countries I expect us to have a crisis in the next 1 to 3 years. Yeah.
You showed the correlations between credit and economy.
Yeah.
And it did not correlate in all cases. It did for Spain, it did not for Germany.
Yeah.
So one thing is it okay to interpret this as general stability of the economy? So meaning if you're dependent on credit, it cannot be a good thing. If you're civil up by having more or less credit available,
Yeah.
effectively cannot be a good thing. So a stable thing would be Germany, unstable in Spain. Is this the right interpretation? And if so, even if not, what are the reasons that in Germany you do not have the correlation and in Spain you have it?
Germany is running a trade surplus of the order of 10% of GDP. And it's doing that largely because of the euro. Okay? If the euro wasn't there, Germany's trade surplus would be a lot lower. Now, I see there are three fundamental ways to create money in a capitalist economy. Banks can lend back more than they get in repayments, which is where credit growth comes from. Governments can spend more than they get back in taxation, whereas growth in fiat money comes from. And you can have a current account surplus, which means the rest of the world effectively is creating your money supply for you. Now, Germany's got such a large degree of the latter that it can actually be reducing private debt and government debt at the same time. But of course, that can't be replicated by the rest of the world. If Germany says, you should all run a trade surplus too, Germany's trade surplus goes to zero. Okay? So that's the great trap. So I see controlling trade deficits and surpluses as far more important than controlling government spending, because as I showed you in that example of the three sectors, I could make that rather than poor households, rich households and firms, I could make a Germany and France and Spain. And then if Germany decides to save, it pushes France and Spain into deficits. Okay? So first thing is letting trade surpluses get out of hand is a very bad idea at a global level, and that's beyond that. You can't blame any other country for being the victim of that. It's the consequences of what somebody else does affecting your accounts. Secondly, you don't want credit to get out of control, because when you borrow money from a bank, you have to repay in money they create. You can't create the money yourself. So the bank credit level matters, and you should not use credit to inflate asset prices. But fundamentally, what the financial sector has been doing has been lending against assets. I have a personal example of that just recently. I've financed one of my sisters to build a storage shed business because she couldn't get a bank loan. Now, once the storage shed business is built, she'll pay me back with a bank loan, and the bank will only give her a loan because they can lend against the collateral. Okay? The wrong way around. That will create money after I've done the loanable funds thing. The financial sector has been allowed to get totally out of control with a power that it has, which is a social power. The only reason banks can create money is not because they're geniuses, far from it. It's because they've got a banking license, which is a social responsibility. Well, we've let them use that for asset price inflation. So strangely enough, what we're focused upon, and the European Union's Commission is more guilty of this than any other institution on the planet, we're obsessed about the government deficit, which is wrong. Governments, the three ways to create money should all be allowed to function, and the safest of the three overall is governments, rather than trade deficits and rather than private. So we're focused upon the wrong one.
Actually, can I just?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thanks, you already started to answer my next question. Is running models is nice, is to understand, but we have to do something practical. I just want to know if you see, the new developing economies that they have to act differently to us. What would you say to China building up beach?
Well, pretty much what China's doing right now, but China's doing it on a socialist scale, but socialist with capitalist intentions, and that is they're using government spending on a grand scale to industrialise their economy dramatically. And remember what Keynes said back in the 30s when he was trying to get governments to decide to stimulate the economy by spending. He said it's better to dig holes and then fill them up again than it is to not do the spending. Well, in effect, China's not digging holes and filling up again. It's building high-speed rail, enormous infrastructure, lots and lots of waste going on in that whole process, but an enormous amount of economic activity, which they can sustain indefinitely so long as 1.4 billion Chinese accept renminbi in payment between themselves.
So what's your forecast for China?
Pardon?
What's your forecast for China?
I think China will get through the crisis better than anybody else, but it still has to have a credit crunch. The rate of growth of private debt in China is 3 times as fast as it was in Japan, which was the previous record. And so, because as soon as China's response to the crisis was basically to tell its banking sector to lend to anybody with a pulse. And credit in 1 year went from about 10% of GDP to 40%. And that's where has anybody been to China and seen those ghost towers? I've been in a couple of them. So the huge waste in terms of concrete monstrosities which will never be lived in. But at the same time, that gave the demand that stopped the slump that occurred after the global financial crisis. But now what the government's doing is this huge Silk Road project, trying to decarbonise their economy at the same time, gigantic government spending, all using the capacity of the government to create money to do that. So even though I definitely believe they have to have a credit crunch, and that will have all sorts of ramifications through the economy, they're now going to such a heavy state construction, state-driven period with technology to do it that I think they'll get through it moderately okay. The ones I think are not going to do so well are the straight capitalist countries, Canada, Australia, South Korea, and maybe Belgium. Yeah.
As a naive question, when we talk about this debt is not recognized or credit, I think everybody is talking about the levels in China as being too high and creating these massive risks, both the private, which is probably state-owned companies. But it seems to be that something everybody recognizes and saying this is a risk. So why do we not call that mainstream now, or is it a reflection of this crisis? And secondly,
I'll answer that. People ask 2 and 3 questions and I forget number 1. It's because it hasn't got to economic theory yet. And the neoclassical economists are still resisting it getting into theory. In that sense, this is one of these classic instances where that statement by the Bundesbank saying a popular misconception that banks don't create money, that's not a popular misconception, it's a misconception of the experts. Now, if you have the experts believing something which is wrong, when the public is more correct, over time the experts win. Imagine what we'd all be thinking about the universe if we still believed astronomers that who told us that the Earth is the centre of the universe. Okay? We still use expressions based on that, sunrise and sunset. We know that's not what happens. So if the experts hang on to a false view, the odds are in the long term that false view will dominate, even though we're talking about it informally amongst ourselves. So we have to change the experts. And I do not trust that the academic institutions will achieve that. I've been in academic economics for 30 years. I've been a student of economics for 45. I've seen the internal dynamics of university departments. Once that belief system dominates, they drive out alternative belief systems. So I really think institutions like the European Commission, the OECD, the Bank of International Settlements, the Bank of England, those are the places where you might develop a realistic alternative, and then you've got to go back and recolonise the academic departments.
Hi, I'm not an economist myself either, but I have a small question. These new fintech products, Bitcoin, essential coin.
Excuse me, speak up. Sorry, do I think that
new fintech products, like initial coin offerings, for instance.
Oh.
Where do you see those? Do they create money or only that?
Well, they do create money if people accept them in transactions. One of Minsky's great points was to say anybody can create money. The difficulty is getting it accepted. Okay, so Bitcoin and things like that. Some people do accept Bitcoin. Transfer Bitcoin. I'll take that pizza. Remember that person who bought a pizza with 50 Bitcoin some decades ago. So they can create money in that sense. The question is, do they have the volume to function as money? Now, Bitcoin, I had a discussion on a Polish website last night, and I asked somebody, how many transactions does Bitcoin support per second right now? And he mumbled around for a while and finally said 5. 5 transactions per second. That wouldn't handle a suburb in Belgium, let alone the entire planet. So it's not money. It's a speculative vehicle. And the price is so volatile because you can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin. 10 years ago, you could have bought 10 Bitcoin with $200. Now you can buy 1/100th of a Bitcoin with the same amount of money. So it's a perfect vehicle for inflation. And there's all sorts of what is in normal stock markets illegal behavior going on in Bitcoin buying right now, dump and sell and stuff like that. So they haven't yet become anything close to money, but there are some people working on cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies which can support hundreds of thousands of transactions. So I think they could be a vehicle, but I'd rather see them have a centralized ledger because part of the reason they're so slow is if you have a distributed ledger, there's so much network traffic necessary to actually decide that somebody's actually got that money in their account that it slows down the whole process. And of course, we know how energy intensive Bitcoin is as well. So I think Bitcoin's going to die as a speculative vehicle at some point, because if it becomes money, you can handle 5 transactions per second and nobody can use it.
But I mean, Bitcoin is only an example, but when you look at the massive amounts that initial coin offerings are covering in half an hour, I mean, where does it come from and does it exist or doesn't it?
Well, see, this is partly one of the dangers of stock markets in general and asset markets in general, because we take the price of the last sale as indicating the average price of the entire stock of whatever is being sold. So if somebody sells a house in Belgium for €2 million, we multiply that 2 million by the number of houses in Belgium and estimate the value of the housing stock. Now, if everybody in Belgium decided to sell their houses, they wouldn't get €2 million, they might get 20. Okay, so we're making a very big error of extrapolating the marginal price times the total quantity to work out the value. So in case of Bitcoin and things like that, a tiny number of transactions can drive that price up. And they've been, I can't recite them because there's not my own work, but I've seen people saying like $1,000 worth of buying of Ethereum can increase the price by $1 billion. It's that volatile because it's the marginal buyer driving up the implied price of the entire stock. When if people tried to sell the entire stock at that price, the price would collapse.
If I understand correctly, you might believe that the present Eurozone recovery is based on cheap money and credit expansion, rather than on what we would think of in classical terms as real growth. You can limit credit either by raising interest interest rates, which I think you're suggesting would be a really bad idea right now, or by banking supervision, where you put limits on the amount that a bank is allowed to lend, for example, reserve ratios or whatever. If you found yourself right now running the ECB, what would you do?
I would probably be hung, drawn and quartered for what I want to do. But what I want to do is develop what I call a modern debt jubilee, because we've let ourselves get in a situation where there's far too much private debt. And the only way out in the past of those crises, there's been about 150 of them in the last 1.5 centuries around the globe. The only way we've got out, bar enormous export surpluses, which by definition can only happen to isolated countries, is by writing the debt off. Okay. Now, how do you write the debt off? Well, you could just simply say we're going to abolish debt, as used to happen in ancient times with the Jubilee. But that would benefit the debtors and not people who are savers. Okay. So my concept is what I call a modern debt jubilee. You use the capacity of the central bank, like quantitative easing, to put money in people's private bank accounts, but you require that money, if they're in debt, must be used to pay their debt down. Now that means people if you get money whether you're a saver or a borrower as a non-bank, so you don't have any moral hazard in that sense. But you also have, I would also say that the people who get the money as savers would then be required to buy corporate shares, where the corporate shares had to be used to cancel corporate debt. Now that would democratise share ownership to a fair degree as well, which I think is essential after the increase in inequality that largely things like QE have contributed to since the crisis. And it also then restrict banks' lending. I wouldn't let banks lend collateralised lending. I'd say if you can lend for working capital for corporations, you can lend for housing against the rental flow of a property, not against the so-called income of the buyer. We need to restrict, since the right to create money is a social right we've created ourselves, which is then given to banks, and we've seen them abuse it. We have to control how they can lend that. But at the same time, you want banking to be profitable. So if you said banks can only lend for working capital and only lend for against the rental income of a property, they'd still get the price margin. They would no longer be getting the volume source of profits. So I'd like to enable banks to lend as well and take an equity position in firms, a form of venture capital. There's a large range of improvements we'd need to make to the financial system, but the essential one is we have to reduce private debt, and the government's capacity through the central bank to create money could be used to do that and drastically reduce private debt levels with very little negative impact upon the macroeconomy in terms of inflation, demand and so on, if you said the money had to be used to buy assets internally and cause a social redistribution towards people who've been actually suffered through the crisis because they don't own shares. The way we've tried to prevent the crisis so far with QE has benefited the rich comparatively to the poor. So QE would, my idea of QE, people's QE or a modern debt jubilee, goes in the opposite direction. And I think I'd be hung, drawn and quartered for it.
Well, the thing is, if you take that explanation backwards, it means that the origin of the Eurozone crisis in, for example, Greece, is due to not just delinquent behaviour on the part of, let's say, the Greek government, but also inadequate banking supervision in the home countries of the banks, which lent to either the government or to institutions within Greece. So a banking supervision problem rather than, at the other end, a debt problem.
It's both. I take the point that if we properly supervise banks, we would never have allowed a bubble like this to happen in Spain. Look at this level here. You can see the euro began in 1999. There's still a decline in credit, still growing at 15% per annum at this stage, and then it reaches 35% of GDP. But we allowed that to happen because the European Union rules focus upon government money creation, not private money creation. Now, if we'd stopped that happening, you wouldn't have had unemployment reaching the levels it did. You wouldn't have had the crisis. So it is a problem both ways. Pardon?
Can I ask a question on?
Yeah, sorry.
On this, I mean, Spain is the marvellous correlation showing how credit and unemployment move in opposite directions. And Germany's the failure, and you say Germany doesn't work because of the large trade surplus.
It doesn't need the credit because of the large trade surpluses, yeah.
Okay, but
yeah.
I mean, the other countries such as Spain were running large trade deficits,
Mm.
but they still have this great correlation.
Oh, yeah.
Why do they not need
Well, see,
to, why do you not need to look at trade with them, but you need
Oh, you do, but see, the deficits make the problem worse. Okay, surpluses make it easier to handle. With a large trade surplus, you don't need to borrow government, you don't need to borrow private money domestically, and you don't need the government to run a deficit either to provide the money supply because it's coming in from your export surplus. But if you've got a trade deficit, then you're even more, oh sorry, pardon me.
No worries.
Okay. You're even more dependent upon private money creation than you are without a trade deficit. The trade deficit makes Spain's case worse, in other words. Okay. So with Germany running a trade surplus, you can have a government surplus and a private surplus at the same time. If you're running a deficit as Spain was doing, then it's got to have either a government deficit or a private deficit or both. Now what it has, of course, was a private deficit, but a government surplus. And according to the European rules, Spain was doing fantastically. Spain was the only country to meet the the Maastricht Treaty standards. It had a private debt ratio of less than, a government debt ratio of less than 60% for most of the period of the euro prior to the crisis, and it was running a surplus for most of that time. It was the poster child. And look what happened to it. It was the poster child because it was borrowing enormous amounts of private money, unregulated. That's its, pardon me, its bubble again here. And that's what made it look good on the other front. Yeah.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the lecture. I would like to ask you, what do you think about the policies, or especially what do your models say about policies which try to disintermediate the bank or provide an alternative to bank financing, such as here the Capital Markets Union project, which tries to have a bit more financing of the European businesses via capital markets, or for example, crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, etc.
If they're not creating money, they might be they're increasing the circulation rate of existing money, and that's useful. But by far, what dominates economic performance is new money creation rather than changing the rate of turnover of existing money. If you look at the American data on the velocity of circulation of money, it's in terms of M1 and M2, it's virtually fallen below 1, whereas it used to be 3. And I think a lot of that's because of the increase in debt. People are spending more slowly, and therefore we're getting a lower level of recorded velocity of circulation. All those various ideas increase the rate of velocity of circulation. They don't create more money unless people who are doing that peer-to-peer lending are borrowing from a bank, or doing what I'm doing, like with my sister's case, I'm funding her in advance and then she's borrowing from a bank. So the creation of money is occurring after the project has been financed. I actually like the idea of peer-to-peer funding, and I think we could actually use those ideas in money creation, because I don't want bureaucrats being the only ones responsible, pardon me for speaking for a room here, but I don't want people who've got a strong argument about being conservative in risk as being the ones to decide how much money gets created and who gets it. So that's one reason I like the idea of private banking, because even though they're taking the wrong risks, part of the ideology of banks is you take lots of risks and one of them will pay off. Now, you can do the same thing now through crowdfunding, and crowdfunding gives you the wisdom of crowds in that sense. Products that maybe a banker wouldn't support, the crowd think that's fabulous, and the crowd then dives into it. For example, one that I know well, I don't know the actual outcome, but I know that the cause, a group of a tiny bunch of bee farmers in Australia invented a beehive which lets you take the honey out of the beehive through a tap. You don't need to smoke it out. This is this particular grill they put in where the bees also put the honey. It leaks, it goes into a jar, and you've got honey just coming out with no fear about being stung by the bees, no need to smoke the bees out, etc., etc. That got 60 times the amount of money they wanted to develop it through crowdfunding. They're having a hard time hoping with the sheer scale of it. But that's the idea of the wisdom of crowds deciding which project needs to get funding. So I think we can employ that. Imagine if we gave everybody in the country a certain sum of money, let's say 1,000 euros, which they had to spend on crowdfunding. And if there was a return to them, then they made a profit. If no return, the money's lost for them, but it's created for circulation. That might be a far more effective way of doing private money creation than giving it to banks. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to have people trying to crowdfund a semiconductor plant where the minimum price level is a couple of $1 billion. You need banks and investment people to make those sorts of decisions. So I think we could use the peer-to-peer stuff, but it has to be creating money. At the moment, it's not creating money.
So essentially you are saying that we cannot avoid another global financial crisis, right?
Yep, that's the the subtitle of you can see the book title there, Can We Avoid? It could be a one-word book, but we're not going to avoid it while we have our current understanding of money, and it's localized. The crisis will not occur in the countries that had a crisis in the past. They will suffer because of a drop in their export demand. But countries like, as I said, China, with the caveat of its huge government spending, Canada, Australia, South Korea, Belgium, possibly Singapore, Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, they're all countries I think are going to have a debt crisis in the near future.
So Iceland was the first to get into the crisis, wasn't it? In 2007?
Well, Iceland fell deepest.
So yes, they got deepest, but at the end, what? I think that they're doing better than Greece.
And they did some.
What are the tricks that they did?
Well, they put bankers in jail.
Okay.
Okay. They refused to pay their debts. Okay. Jubilee. They had a jubilee.
So you have listed some of those.
Yeah, I mean, the only big mistake, apart from letting the bubble happen in the first place, they also took Milton Friedman seriously, and they set their mortgages in real terms rather than nominal. So if you took out like a €1 million mortgage in Iceland, and the inflation rate was 20%, next year you had a €1.2 million mortgage, and they still haven't got rid of that particular rule, so far as I'm aware. But they wrote the debt off, they shut the banks down, they put the banks in jail, and that actually involved the Icelandic people surrounding their parliament, because it's such a small country, 300,000 people I think, 50,000 of them were with pitchforks around the parliament when whoever the ruler was supposed to sign the document that would indenture Iceland to pay back its debts for the next 20 years to the foreign banks and the foreign depositors, and he refused to sign the document. The government was changed. So they went through a very, very severe political shift, but they were small enough and enough of a community to do that successfully themselves. I think okay.
Actually, on the case of Iceland, for your information, the Minister of Economics at that moment is actually now in Brussels. He's the deputy head for EFTA, and I was trying to bring him over for a discussion. So I think I will let you know when he comes, so he can tell us what happened. And he was saying that he was being spat at in the street, and he could hardly get out of his house. So just to know what it costs in terms of personal, cost. So I would like to thank you very much for this very enlightening conference, and you're always welcome to come again.
Thank you. Thanks for a great reception. Thank you. I'll just
pass the message to our colleagues.